Now, a little bit of a question from left field. The church parishes of Britain collected the names, births, deaths and marriages of all the people in the land, and this created one of the most complete and detailed historical accounts of the common people. Other nations around the world don't have this, and I personally spent some time going back through the old churches for my family and tracing it back right to the Tudor period with quite a lot of ease. And it turns out we were selling wine in the Henry VIII's court, as you do from France. But taxation gave the peasants a way to connect to their personal history. Does having more than 1,000 years of history for the common people on record impact the people of the West?
I think it does, in as much as it has us understand where we have come from. And one of the things that, and you alluded before to the attack of the left of our history on the idea of woke and what that might mean, is all of that is an attempt to disassociate ourselves, to remove us from our history, from our background, from our culture, from our tradition of freedom. And the rise in the interest in family history, the fact that you'll go to any bookshop and the shelves are bulging with history books, popular history, academic history, the history of the common people, just reveals that the more our history is attacked, in fact, the more people want to engage with it and want to understand it. And I think that's something really exciting. And you see it in just exactly as you've said, what people do with their free time, studying what previous generations have done.
Well, we often hear activists today complaining about intergenerational trauma, particularly minority groups, about how they had to move off their land, but European ancestors were continuously displaced, killed, enslaved and forced to fight in battles that they didn't understand, for kings they didn't know, in countries they didn't have any interest in going to. The system of taxation almost acts as a page number in history, but it is interesting to see how these external features can impact liberty. Even the most zealous of COVID panickers would have to admit that COVID measures increased authoritarian behaviour in our governments and set us down a path of increasing control. Like, for example, we had COVID check-in apps to track and limit our movement of citizens within the economy, which has never happened in the whole of Western civilization. Now, this in turn softened the population up to the idea of digital identity, which is another infringement upon the free market economy of our commerce. But in the world of the Magna Carta, you talk about a city where people have more liberty than the rural communities, and that when the big plague struck and killed roughly half the population, this made England more free. It turned the rulers into making decisions that increased liberty. So how does war and a virus in medieval England make them more free, whereas our response has been to make ourselves less free? Do you find that interesting?
It's really interesting. And the plagues in Britain, the plagues in Europe, gave the workers power. It increased their wages. It allowed them to move between jobs and move between villages and towns, which they hadn't been able to do before. It empowered people with more choices, and their rulers, their bosses, their employers or their guild masters were then having to respond to that. What happened in the times in COVID, I'm coming to you from Melbourne, the world's most locked down city outside of China.
That's your subtitle in Melbourne, most locked down city in the world. You've got that forever now. Congratulations.
And now about to be the most blacked out city in the world too. What we saw was the government ruling by fear. And we saw the government saying that they would do one thing, but then doing another. And that is, again, the history of government. It's ever expanding. As we talked about, 10% of a tax on income or capital 800 years ago would have been outrageous. Now taxes are 50% or more. You mentioned the COVID app, Alexandra. So we were absolutely told, all Australians, that the COVID app, whether of the federal government or the state government, would only ever be used to manage COVID, to manage our health. Well, within days of it being introduced, we found out that police forces around Australia were using it for purposes that had nothing to do with COVID whatsoever. that were arguably unlawful and which they still have not apologised for. And then when, as you know, the authorities were asked, well, why are you using this power that you now have? The authorities said, well, if we have this power, we think we should use it. So one of the things coming back to the Magna Carta that the Barons understood very well is that you are always going to have to constrain the power of the state, because the more power that it has, the more power it is willing to use.
Well,